All right, here we are with our Dig Deeper for the week, the genre tool. How exciting that we get to talk about genre. Hey, this is really important. The chapter itself, I think, is a little weak for this lesson. And what I wanted to do, as you know, is not only teach a tool, but also through using that tool, get into the Scripture and be able to hear from God from the Scripture as we have been examining how to apply the tool to a specific text. And the chapters have done a great job. The authors have done a great job of doing that for us in their illustrations and examples, and even in the Dig Deeper exercises. But I think this chapter is a little weak on that, and so we're going to have to work on that a little bit. But what I want to do in this video here for a few moments is just talk about the importance of understanding genre itself. The Bible is one book. There is no doubt about that. 66 collections of writings that form this grand narrative of what God has been doing and will continue to do in this work of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. That's the big deal. But in this, we see there are many different genres at play. Most of the Bible uses narrative, but then we also know there's prophecy. Then there's this apocalyptic part of things, which is just strange and bizarre. And then we have poetry in there. And what do we do with that? I hated poetry in high school. I hated poetry in college. That's why I switched from being an English major to a sociology major. So what in the world are we supposed to do with these? And how does understanding genre change the way we interpret a text? Because it will. So what I want to do is just take a few points first from their chapter to bring out. These are good teaching points, I think, that they do bring out. And then I want to cover the Dig Deeper section on page 109 and answer those questions quickly and talk about a couple of challenges in there. And then probably in a second video, maybe get into a few texts and really look at how genre helps us. Understanding what genre is helps us interpret a text. So that's where we're going to go with these few videos. Page 105. Take a look there. Early on in that first paragraph, when they talk about genres, they say it's a way of classifying media according to their type or style, rather than their specific content or storyline. So it is. We're talking about type and style here, and they talk about this is a very easy connection for us, is when we think about the genre of movies and film. You think of horror movie, western, dark comedy, chick flick, documentary, etc., etc. And so that's a good way of picturing genre in our current context. And so the challenge with genre, you see on the paragraph about halfway down that page in 105, that full paragraph there. Sadly, we can't give you a guaranteed 100% accurate way of deciding on the genre of a passage. So this is one of those tools that you may not get it 100% right all the time. There's even some texts in Scripture that are going to be debated amongst scholars and biblical commentators as to what genre it is. For the most part, we can tell, but there are definitely going to be some challenges. And then just basically, as we get in our Bibles, sometimes we might simply miss it. But we want to do the best we can in deciphering what the genre is. And then on page 106, these 2 points, once you've decided on a genre, here are the 2 general principles to follow. So if we're trying to give our folks some tools, some basic things to use, these are 2 general principles. Number 1, when something is presented as historical fact, so you're going to see this mostly in narrative. We're going to talk about all the different genres in the Scripture in a moment. Pause to consider that it really happened. Now, we know, per the doctrine of inspiration, that the text itself is what is inspired, not the event. Okay? The event is not inspired. Now, the event is God's revelation of Himself. But when we read about the Exodus itself was not inspired. It was the power of God. It was miracle. It was God's revelation. But the text we have before us is what is inspired. And what that means is that is the text that God specifically wants before us for a specific reason, for a specific purpose. See the author's purpose tool. So we need to constantly ask ourselves, why has the author written these words in the way they're written? Why has he connected them? Why has he presented this information? But I think the authors here do a good job of reminding us, let's go back and realize there may be something that we learn about God in the actual event itself, in God's revelation. Now, the way it's communicated to us, the inspired text is key, but the inspired text may simply be wanting to point us back to that historical event. So we need to be thinking through this. And so we just need to be in awe of our awesome God when we see, as they describe in this chapter, the account of him parting the Red Sea so the Israelites can come through. I mean, he actually did that. And so that's important. So when something is presented as historical fact, pause to consider that it really happened. Number two, when something is presented as imagery or metaphor, don't base crazy predictions of the future on its being literally and physically true. This is the giant can of theological worms that gets opened over and over and over again by so many folks, especially predicting end times and getting the charts together of how it's all going to play out. And usually when you hear people say that they can decide or claim a certain date or time when Christ will return, well, number one, when they do that, discredit them totally. But number two, it's because most of the time what they've done is they've confused genre, and they've taken imagery and metaphor and applied the tools of, or the rules of historical fact and narrative to those images and those metaphors, and so that's what happens. So when something is presented as imagery or metaphor, don't base your crazy predictions of the future on it being literally and physically true. If you have crazy predictions on the future, base those on something else other than the scripture. And so they go through the chapter and talk about these things in more detail, stuff that really happened and stuff that we shouldn't take literally. I like the statement on page 107, right in the middle, that middle paragraph at the bottom of it. Let's never forget the Gospels are not merely a written philosophy, but eyewitness testimony of someone whom the apostles had seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands. This really happened, gang. Bottom of 107, where we sometimes get it wrong is with the genre known as apocalyptic. Apocalypto is the Greek word, just means to reveal. That's why the book of Revelation in Greek is called the Apocalypse, right? Because it's God's revelation of himself. So apocalyptic literature, the apocalyptic genre, is a very specific revelation of God to his people, but often cloaked in imagery, metaphor, dreams, and visions. This includes Revelation, Daniel, parts of Ezekiel, and Zechariah. And so, and I don't know if you want to bring this up or not, with your classes. Depends on how keen they are on Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. But they bring up the reality that if you've come across the popular Left Behind books, you'll know some Christians take these passages very literally. And they say here, we think that's a mistake. We'll try to show you why. And so you can use this example. We'll get to it in a moment in Revelation 21. Well, let's move to the dig deeper. Well, actually, first let's stop there and think about the actual genres that are present in the Scripture. Okay, and some of them, sometimes if you see lists or you think through what is present, maybe some different words will be used to describe genre. Maybe it's teaching, or someone will say didactic, narrative, or someone will say story, but there's some basic ones there in the Scripture. We do have teaching, which often is called didactic, or it's even discourse. You want to remember those two D words, discourse and didactic. Didactic coming from the Greek word didaskalon, or teaching. And so this is just that genre in the Scripture of when a truth is being taught to us or to others. And so we see this when Jesus is in his discourses loaded in the Gospel of John. We see this in the Sermon on the Mount. Anytime Jesus is teaching somebody, now that's narrative, which we'll get to in a second here, but embedded in that narrative is discourse and it's teaching. The epistles, okay, that's didactic. When Paul says, this is how you are to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, as he tells the Colossians in Colossians chapter 1. That's teaching. Okay, so we take that and we say, okay, this is the lesson that we learn. We approach that in a very specific way, looking at what is being said, And what is the context? What is the implication? It's fairly straightforward. But a lot of times, as we said, that teaching, those discourses are embedded in narrative. And narrative is our second genre. And narrative is just this story of the historical events. And most of the Bible is actually comprised of narrative. So we would do well to become good storytellers because the Bible presents itself in basically a story form. There is a progression of the character development, and there is the moving forward, the advancement of the plot, and we have to know, going back to previous tools, author's purpose and why he presents the narrative as he does. But we have to understand it is narrative. There is something happening, and so he purposely presents this narrative before us. But that is a recollection of historical fact as it happened. The next genre is poetry, and we see this in our wisdom literature, Psalms and Proverbs, and even in Job. And then we also see poetry in various places, which we'll look at in the next video. Again, embedded in narrative. You'll see folks break out in song. Well, that becomes a poetry genre that we then have to interpret differently. And so we'll look at how to do that in a moment. There are the parables of Christ. That's its own specific genre because we have to look at those differently than we would. Again, embedded in narrative, but it's a parable. We have the prophetic. A lot of the scripture is made up of prophecy, this looking into the future. Now, the tricky thing is much of the prophecy in scripture we live on the other side of. We look back at what the prophets prophesied about. There is some prophecy in future still, but most prophecy in scripture has already happened. And so that's another hoop to jump through there. But it's prophetic, has its own set of rules for interpretation. And then there's apocalyptic, which we've mentioned already in this video, and that is oftentimes it's prophetic imagery depicting the end times. And a lot of times with apocalyptic literature, it makes it so difficult is it's put in dreams and visions, and you know how crazy our dreams are. A lot of times, when you have this, these pictures that were given to these prophets through dreams, it is bizarre. You say, what do you do with that stuff? And so we have to think through that well. So what I want to do in the next video actually now is I want to cut this video here. Next video, let's go through these different genres and think about some basic interpretive tools for each genre. So we'll see you back here in just a moment.